A sparrow perched on the windowsill, bathed in sunlight, singing of its joy in a new day, both of which were stabbing into Ella's brain, even though her eyes were still closed. She whimpered and pulled the pillow over her face, but it didn't help. The housewarming party for the home she shared with her twin sister had been one for the ages, but she was paying the price. A click and a creak accompanied the door opening, followed by shuffling footsteps and a pitiful groan. "Could you just smother me?" Ella muttered to her sister. "Only if you do me first," Tara answered as she sat down on the foot of the bed. Ella experimentally lifted the pillow and discovered that her sister had closed the curtains. The light was still too bright, but subdued enough that she felt safe to push the pillow away. She raked her fingers through her dark blonde hair and made a face because her locks were sticking out in every which direction. A look around through squinted eyes didn't reveal her phone, so she asked, "What time is it?" "Almost noon." "I swear I'm never doing this again." Tara let out a half-hearted chuckle. "You always say that." "So do you. It was a great party, though." "The best." Ella sat up, though it made her head pound and her vision swim. The lemony smell of furniture polish that lingered in the house after the final marathon cleaning was turning her stomach. "Have you seen John?" she asked. Tara pointed at the nightstand and said, "There's a note. It probably says the same thing mine does. They went into town to get us Excedrin since we didn't have any in the house. Guess we should have told them, huh?"
"Guess they should have told us they were going instead of leaving us notes," Tara countered. She started to chuckle, but it cut off in a pained groan as she covered her eyes.
"Time to go before my head explodes. Do you see my phone?" Ella asked. Her twin slid off the bed and said, "Here's the cord." When she traced it from the outlet to one of Ella's discarded shoes, she found the phone beneath. Ella took the phone and tapped out a hasty message to her husband-to-be. Gone to Giemma's pool. With a little help from her sister, Ella crawled out of bed and started through the house. It had once been their great-grandfather's, and a family friend's before that, but the family had secretly renovated the place for them when they both announced their engagements. After the work, the downstairs was essentially 2 apartments joined by a central living room, kitchen, and dining room. The arrangement gave both twins their own space on opposite ends of the house, but acknowledged that they would never be very far apart. The sunlight streaming into the front room through a huge bay window felt like lasers burning into Ella's head. The state of the room also provided a pointed reminder that they still had to clean up from the party. Salvation was close at hand, however. The twins hurried as best they could in their delicate state to the front door, across the porch, and down the stairs. The moment their bare feet touched the grass, their headaches began to fade. Caring not a whit that they were dressed in nothing more than t-shirts and panties, they crossed the lawn to the woods. The trail they followed was one they knew well, and every step along it brought a new surge of energy. Anyone else would have seen nothing more than a wall of trees and undergrowth surprisingly thick for the first week of April. Such was the magic of their great-grandmother's woods that it hid its secrets. The scent of honeysuckle filled the air. Squirrels, rabbits, and chipmunks scurried everywhere. With the symptoms of their overindulgence already nothing more than a memory, the singing of birds was a joyful accompaniment to their walk. Flowers bloomed, adding splashes of vibrant colour to the myriad shades of green and brown lining their path. It was a place of peace and oneness with nature that was as much their home as any man-made structure. Golden sunlight breaking through the canopy, and a silvery laugh marked the end of their journey. "Morning, Grandma. Morning, Grandpa," Ella said, dropping the grate when she entered the clearing. The dryad Xantina stood amidst the ferns at the edge of her crystal-clear pool waiting for them. Intimately connected to her family, she'd known the twins were coming as soon as they did. She appeared no older than the sisters, and had no shame for her nudity. With skin that shone golden in the light and hair the colour of new leaves, she was a stunning and beautiful sight. "Take away your coverings and come swim with me," the nymph declared, and then turned to dive gracefully into the pool. Ella was all too glad to do so. Their great-grandfather Daniel chuckled as the twins undressed. Once a mortal man, the love and magic of his dryad mate had granted him a body of nature that could remain at her side long after his natural span. Though he had green hair and skin that resembled the bark of a tree, he otherwise looked like a handsome, fit, nude man in his 20s. "From the way you girls' hair looks, I take it the party was a success," he said. "The best," Ella confirmed, and her twin echoed her a moment later. "And the old place is working out for you?" he asked. "It's perfect," Ella said. "Thank you, Grandpa." "No need for thanks. I hated to see the place sitting empty," he said, and then snapped a hand up to block the side of his face. Their great-grandmother's splash still soaked him. Xantina pouted. "Talk later." "Yes, dear," Daniel chuckled, and then stood up. "So, while you have company for a while, I'm going to go borrow a newspaper and catch up." Tara said, "Tell Grandma we said hello," knowing it was his daughter's paper he was going to borrow. "Will do. Have fun." Ella took advantage of the distraction. She darted toward the pool and laughed when her sister called out, "Cheetah!" A moment later, she hit the water in a flawless dive and surfaced on the far side of the pool. Her sister was only a second behind her, but the splash she launched when she surfaced found only air. Ella popped back up from below the water, and her splash caught Tara full in the face. It was on. The girls called a truce several minutes later when they were both panting for breath and laughing too hard to continue. It was then that Ella saw John and Nathan coming down the trail. They were new to the family secret and entered the clearing with poorly concealed nervousness. Both sisters had been afraid to tell their beaux about their heritage and had only found the courage out of necessity when the two friends had proposed to them at the same time at the end of the previous summer. A nudge from Tara indicated that her sister wanted to play a different game. Careful to address both young men, Ella asked, "Feeling better?" Nathan revealed his surprise when he answered, "Yeah, a lot." "How?" John asked. "Magic," Tara said and wiggled her fingers. "Guess we dragged ourselves out of bed and to the store for nothing, huh?" John replied. Tara said, "Uh-huh, best hangover cure ever." Nathan laughed. "Can't argue with that." "So," Ella paused dramatically and then finished, "why are you two still dressed again?" The boys inevitably blushed. The commonplace nudity of the family was something they weren't remotely used to yet. They did kick off their shoes to begin stripping, though. Ella was used to the state of undress, but that didn't stop her from admiring John as he disrobed, and peeking at Nathan. They were two of a kind, leanly muscled and well-endowed. They were just as beautiful on the inside as well. John was the most caring, considerate, and good-humoured man Ella had ever met. Not for the first time, she thanked her lucky stars that she'd outgrown her fixation on jocks to discover him before someone else snatched him up. Nathan had been a friend to her and her sister all their life, and had patiently waited until the day Tara finally recognised the love hiding right under her nose. Caught up in a flood of memories and arousal, she started when her sister whispered, "Hey." "Sorry," Ella whispered back. The sisters locked eyes, took a deep breath, and then ducked down under the water. Once below the surface, Ella swam to the right to reverse position with Tara, and then kicked off the bank toward the opposite shore. Once there, they turned to face their beaux. Ella could see in John's eyes that he knew what was afoot. The twins simultaneously said, "Come on in, John." Nathan held up his hands. "I know better than to give you any hints." When John looked to him for help, Nathan had always been able to tell them apart. Xantina laughed, recognising the game her great-granddaughters were playing. She caught John's eye, which only deepened his blush, and said, "Look with this." She held a hand over her heart, and then lifted it to cover her eyes. "Not with these." John blew out a long breath as he took the couple of steps through the ferns to the edge of the pool. After filling his lungs with air again, he dived in. Ella's heart sang when he veered toward her, though she did her best not to show it when he came up in front of her. Tara's voice held a faux warning when she said, "Are you sure?" You're about to kiss my sister." The game was over when he looked deep into Ella's eyes and said, "I'm sure, Tara." Ella threw her arms around him and kissed him hard. One last quiver shook Ella when she peeked out of the bathroom at John sprawled on the bed amidst the tangled sheets. They hadn't remained long at the pool after the boys had arrived, and the twins had pulled their men straight to the bedroom upon returning to the house. In the grip of a burst of energy after recovering from several intense orgasms, she could see that John was experiencing quite the opposite. "You aren't asleep, are you?" she asked. He started and turned toward her to answer. "No." "Liar," she said, and then laughed. "Come wash up. We still have to clean up from the party and take a shower before it's time to go to your mum's for dinner." John let out a pitiful groan as he did so, but he sat up and slipped out of the bed. Ella stopped brushing her hair to admire his body, and more specifically his manhood swinging with his steps. She made eye contact and licked her lips when he had nearly reached her. He shuddered and said, "Stop that." "I don't want to," she teased, and then slapped his butt as he walked into the bathroom. John grabbed a washcloth, but before wetting it, he leaned down to splash water on his face. The sight made Ella's sex tingle, and she had to force herself to look into the mirror before she dragged him back to the bed. She chuckled at his gasp when he put the washcloth to work between his legs. "Oh," she said, remembering something. "Did you get that recipe from your mum?" "Yeah, I forgot. It's, I think it's on the dresser." "Yours or mine?" "Mine." Ella turned her head back and forth, decided her hair was good and put down the brush. "Hurry up, I'm going to go get dressed." "Okay. I love you." She moaned from the chill that his initiating that exchange caused. "Love you too." In the bedroom, she opened a drawer to retrieve a pair of panties. She reached for a bra but then changed her mind. They weren't going anywhere for a while, and she didn't feel like needlessly enduring the discomfort of having her large breasts confined. She was straightening from pulling on her panties when John walked into the room with his eyes fixed on her. "What?" she asked, covering her breasts in a false display of modesty. "You just look beautiful." She crinkled her nose and smiled. Good answer. He went to his dresser while Ella selected a pair of shorts and a top from hers. Once dressed, she walked over to give him a peck on the lips, and then looked for the recipe. "That's it there," he said, pointing out a folded piece of purple paper. Ella picked it up, but read the flyer it was written on before turning it over to look at the recipe. "From my Aunt Carolyn's church. They're trying to raise money for this church camp they run. I went there a bunch of summers," he explained. Recognizing the name God's Green Earth Campground, she asked, "Is it by the state forest?" "That's the one. Something about the property taxes." Her brow knitted when she turned to him. "I didn't think churches had to pay taxes." "The church doesn't own the land. The lady who does always let them use it, but she ended up in a nursing home a couple of years ago." "That's so sad," she said as she turned the paper over. "Yeah, I guess it's a lot of money. My aunt's been busy trying to organise fundraisers." "So that's why I haven't met her yet?" It was a question she'd been meaning to ask for a while, because his Aunt Carolyn was essentially a second mother to him. His mother had been in a bad car accident when he was little. She had spent almost a year in the hospital, and the better part of another recovering enough to have him in the house with her full time. He had lived with his aunt during those couple of years. "Yeah, a lot of it is on weekends, so she's always had plans when I called." Tara interrupted by hollering from down the hall, "A little help out here." "Keep your pants on," Ella yelled. Tara came right back with, "Put yours on and move it, sis." "We could always sneak out the window," John suggested, as he wrapped his arms around her from behind. Tempting, but we'd have to come back eventually." "True." Ella sighed, spun in his arms and kissed him. As their tongues slipped over each other, Tara loudly cleared her throat from the front room, and Nathan laughed. Ella pulled back from the kiss and playfully growled before going to face the task at hand. John buried his face in the arm of the couch and groaned. "Oh, you're adorable," Ella said while patting his back and looking at the album of childhood pictures his mother had brought out. The clean-up from the party had gone quickly. For the most part, it involved straightening up the clutter and sorting the recyclables. Once the partygoers had reached a certain point of inebriation, the difference between the bins had escaped them. After sweeping the floor, there was even time to get a little studying done before going to John's house for dinner with his mother. "Your first birthday," Ella said while looking at the last picture on the page. He was sitting next to a cake with a single candle and wearing a huge grin. Her face full of barely contained mirth, John's mother said, "Turn the page." "Oh God," John groaned without lifting his face from the couch. Ella burst into laughter when she saw the next picture of John with his foot in the cake. Tears welled up in her eyes from the one that followed of him desperately trying to stick his frosting-covered foot in his mouth. John finally sat up and, his voice dripping with sarcasm, said, "Thanks, Mum. I really appreciate this." Ella leaned against him and laughed even harder. John's mother smiled sweetly. "Well, honey, she needs to know what she's getting into. What sort of mother would I be if I didn't prepare her for the kind of trouble you get yourself into?" "One who was still on the Christmas list," he muttered. Ella caught her breath and tried to say, "I'm sorry," but only managed to finish part of the sorry before she snorted and fell into another fit of laughter. After a few seconds, she composed herself enough to say, "I'm sorry. I can't help it." He shook his head, sighed, and slipped his arm around her. His mother said, "I'm sure she has plenty of embarrassing pictures. Just ask her mother the next time you're over there. This is a special time for mothers to get even for all the times you made us want to pull our hair out." That brought Ella up short. It was worse than that. Her parents had video. She looked at John and knew she was in trouble when a positively evil grin spread across his face. "But for now, it's your turn," his mother said, and flipped to the next page in the album. Ella chuckled when she saw a picture of him red-faced and scowling as a doctor examined his ear with an otoscope. "He's never liked going to the doctor," his mother said. "Speaking of which," John sighed. "I take it that means you haven't gone?" He stood up and said, "No, I haven't got around to it. I'm going to the bathroom." "You haven't been since your senior year checkup," she called after him. She shook her head when he ignored her. Him and doctors. "Would you like me to get him to go?" Ella asked. Her expression brightened and she asked, "Would you?" "I'll have him in before next week's over," Ella promised, and then winked. "You are an angel," the older woman said. "He's still on my insurance and I'll pay for anything it doesn't cover, so don't let him use that as an excuse." "Got it." The doorbell rang and John's mother frowned. Who in the world could that be? "Want me to get it?" John asked as he returned to the room. No, I've got it," she said, and then went to answer the door. When she opened it, she said, "Oh, Carolyn, this is a surprise." "Hey, Aunt Carolyn," John called out and waved to her. Ella's heart turned to ice when she saw the woman's features tighten. "Come in," John's mother said. "You're busy. I'll come back some other time," his aunt responded and turned to leave. "Carolyn," his mother chided under her breath. John stood up and said, "Aunt Carolyn." When she didn't respond, he hurried toward the door. "Aunt Carolyn, wait." John's mother shut the door and turned back toward the couch. Her expression spoke of both shame and pain when she tried to explain. "Ella, It's about me," Ella guessed. The older woman took a deep breath and nodded. She walked back to the couch and sat down. "My sister's very religious. Her voice trailed off, and she was once again unable to speak. Unfortunately, it wasn't the first time Ella had encountered that particular brand of prejudice. She thinks I'm a heathen who's leading him into sin. I'm so sorry, John's mother said, her voice quavering. I've been trying to talk sense into her, but she just won't listen. I understand, Ella said. When she heard the sound of a car door, she looked at the window and could see John's shadow on the curtain. His shoulders slumped, and he sank down onto the porch swing in front of the window. I don't think John will. The car outside fired up and drove away. Ella saw him drop his head into his hands and instinctively stood up to go to him. She wasn't the only one, though. John's mother smiled at her and said, "Go," as she sat back down. Are you sure? Ella asked. Yes, I'm right here if you need me. Thank you, Ella responded. It meant a lot to her that his mother would set aside her maternal instincts, especially in light of what had just happened. He dropped his hands and sat up straight when she opened the door, but she could still see the anguish in his face. Are you okay? She asked as she sat down next to him and took his hand. Not really. Do you want to talk about it? He winced. She wasn't surprised. To save him the pain of trying to explain, she said, Your mum told me what was going on. She knew. Why didn't she say anything to me? I don't know for sure, but she said she was trying to talk to your aunt. Maybe she hoped she could fix everything before you knew anything about it. His voice tight and carrying touches of anger, he said, She should have told me. Maybe, but what's done is done. She was just trying to protect you, and me, I guess. He closed his eyes for a second and then said, I'm sorry, It's... She squeezed his hand. It's not your fault. I'm more worried about you than I am about what she thinks of me. I don't understand, he said, shaking his head. I thought she'd be happy for me. It doesn't make any damn sense. I know, maybe she just needs time. I don't know, he sighed, looking out at nothing. Why don't we go back inside? I know your mum is worried and it's getting a little chilly out here. Yeah, okay, he answered, his voice distant. Ella stood, still holding his hand, and he rose with her. As soon as he was on his feet, she pulled him close and cradled his head on her shoulder. I love you. I love you too. She held him for a minute or so more until he lifted his head. After giving him a kiss on the temple, she led him back inside. Ella awakened to the soft morning light filtering through the curtains. She turned to look at John and saw his brow was furrowed. He'd had a rough night of tossing, turning, and muttering in his sleep. She reached out to caress his hair and smiled when she saw his features soften. Not wanting to wake him, she slipped slowly out of the bed, straightened her nightshirt, and crept out into the front room. How's he doing? Tara asked. Once John had fallen asleep, Ella had gone straight to her own lifelong rock of support, her sister, and told her what happened. It was a rough night. He didn't sleep very well, Ella answered as she looked out the window and toward the woods. How about you? Ella sat down next to her sister on the couch and answered, I'm okay, just drained. Seeing that Tara was fully dressed, she asked, Are you going somewhere? Breakfast with Mum? Is there anything at the house you want me to grab while we're there? Nothing I can think of. I told her you probably wouldn't feel like coming, but... She lifted her eyebrows in a silent question. I don't want to wake John, and I want to be here when he wakes up. Okay. Tara held out her arms in invitation, and the twins hugged. I'm only a phone call away. Mum said to tell you the same thing. Thanks. Tara nodded toward her end of the house. I'm going to go see if Nathan's out of the shower. Tell Mom I said I love her. Knowing Nathan would have questions as well, Ella decided to head back to her bedroom and let her sister answer them. The flyer with the recipe on it caught her eye as she walked in, and she pursed her lips in thought. There was something about the campground that she could almost remember, but it was escaping her. It was something to take her mind off of things, so she sat down at the desk, grabbed her tablet, and did a search for the name. A website popped up in the results, and when she clicked it, she knew what had been lurking at the edge of her consciousness. The campground went to great lengths to be green. Almost all of the small amount of power the place used was solar generated. The cabins had been built from salvaged lumber. The lake was never treated with any sort of chemicals, and only the relatively small swimming area was cleared of moss and cattails. Decades before Ella was born, the owner had replanted a part of the forest lost to an arson fire, and it now thrived. It gave her an idea. If she contacted the various conservation groups her family supported, she might be able to help raise the money to save the campground. It certainly fit the bill as a place worthy of protecting from a government takeover. And it might help convince John's aunt she wasn't the devil's temptress after all. With a plan in mind, she closed the browser and put the tablet down just as John stirred. "Morning," she said as he blinked the sleep out of his eyes. He stretched and echoed, "Morning. Want some breakfast? Some homemade apples and cinnamon oatmeal, maybe?" He smiled, which heartened her, and answered, "That sounds good. I'll go get started then." She had just finished dicing the apple when John walked into the kitchen, still in his boxers. "Where did Tara and Nate take off to this early?" "They're having breakfast with Mum," she answered. "We have the whole house to ourselves for a while." "Do they know what happened?" She held up a chunk of apple and he opened his mouth to accept it. As he crunched, she said, "I couldn't not tell Tara. She knew something was wrong the moment we walked in the door last night." "That's okay. I get the sister thing. I just wondered." "Yeah, you know she won't press you about it, and I don't think Nathan will either." He leaned against the island counter where she worked and said, "I know. I don't even want to think about it. I just want to forget and move on. Nothing we can do about it anyway." She knew it wasn't going to be that easy, but could sense that for the time being, it was what he needed to try to do. "You could get the oats out for me. They're in the second cabinet." He squeezed her butt before going to fulfill that request. She was up in the air about whether that was a good sign, or whether he was trying to convince himself everything was all right. They talked as they cooked, ate and washed the dishes. The conversation ranged from college to friends to television shows. Anything except what had happened the night before. Then, when they finished brushing their teeth, he moved in behind her and pulled her close. She could feel his hardness against her butt and gasped from the unexpected advance. Between kisses on her neck that gave her shivers, he said, "We've got the house to ourselves. Want to take advantage of it?" She was fairly certain he was trying to bury his feelings, but it was hard to argue with his choice of ways to do it. Rationalizing in an aroused instant that the intimacy would do them both good, she gasped, "Yes." For the rest of the day, John acted as if nothing had happened. It worried her just as much as if he'd remained withdrawn and distant, though she did her best not to show it. Someone he thought of as a parent had disowned him, and she knew that wasn't something anyone could shake off in a day. Once they split up on campus to go to their first class the following day, she sent an email about the campground to her Aunt Kia, who handled most of the contacts for the family. If her plan worked, he might not have any feelings to suppress. A little over halfway through the lecture, her phone vibrated. She brought up the message from her aunt, which read, "Can you give me a call?" Ella answered, "In class, but I'll call you between in about 15 minutes. Once out of the room, she made the call. When her aunt picked up, she asked, "So, you got my email?" "Yes, I got it," her aunt answered. "I'm afraid I have bad news." "What?" "I saw one of the flyers for an ice cream social a couple of weeks ago and looked up the campground. When I saw how they operated, I floated the idea of supporting them to a lot of the local organisation chapters. Nobody will touch it with a 10-foot pole." Ella stopped in her tracks just outside the building and asked, "But why?" "It's too closely associated with the church." "What's that have to do with anything?" Ella asked while stepping out of the way of the crowd emerging behind her. Kia sighed. "You know how polarised things are. All it takes is disagreeing on one issue, and all the places where you agree don't mean anything." "It's so stupid," Ella spat in frustration. I'm with you, Kia said. That's not all, though. Once I found that out, I put together a donation from the family and sent it to them. They returned it unopened. With the defeat she felt creeping into her voice, Ella said, They wouldn't take the money because it was coming from us. That's what I have to assume. The stupid is going both ways. Just wonderful, Ella muttered. Don't be down on yourself. Your heart was in the right place. You can't help it if everyone else's heads are up their behinds. Ella winced, because she wasn't really thinking about the campground as much as finding a way to get into the good graces of John's aunt. Thanks for trying anyway, I have to get to class. Sorry, sweetie, goodbye. Ella said her goodbye and ended the call. At first, having her idea go down in flames so quickly left her despondent. It wasn't long before a spark of determination ignited and began to grow, though. She wasn't going to give up so easily. During her next break between classes, she called her father. With his connections as a state senator, she hoped he might be able to do something from the government side. Hello, Ella, he said when he picked up the phone. Hey, Dad, are you busy? Only busy banging my head on the desk. Trying to get anything done at the State House since we lost our supermajority is frustrating, to say the least. That made her second guess what she was about to say, but she went ahead and asked anyway. I was wondering if you could do me a favour. Such as? There's this campground called God's Green Earth that's having problems with property taxes. He interjected. That's the one we tried to send some money to and they sent it back, right? That's it. I was hoping there was something you could do. I could look into it, but if they wouldn't take our money, I don't think they're going to let me do anything else to help them either. She had been so dead set on finding another way that she hadn't even considered that before jumping into the plan to call him. He was right, and she knew it. The church, or John's aunt, didn't want their help, and nothing was going to change that. Remembering the earlier conversation with Kia, she decided to actually do the right thing. The campground had an earth-friendly ethos that she appreciated, and there was no way of knowing who would end up with the land if it was foreclosed upon for unpaid taxes. But maybe there's something you can do without letting her know it's you, she asked. Confused, he asked. Her? Ella blushed and corrected her Freudian slip. Them, I mean. I'll make some calls. I looked at the website and it's a nice place. I'd hate to see them lose it. Thanks, Dad. You're welcome, honey. I'll let you know if there's anything I can do. Okay, bye. Love you, bye. The disappointment followed her through the day, right up until she met John for lunch. Simply seeing him was enough to brighten her spirits, but it also reminded her there was a way she could earn some points with at least one member of his family. It was time to convince her fiancé to get his annual checkup. She waited until they were done eating, and then scooted closer to him on the wall where they were sitting. He slipped an arm around her, and she leaned against his shoulder. Why don't you want to go in for a checkup? She asked. Ah, crap, he said, and then chuckled. Mum's bringing out the big guns. She put you up to this, huh? After his earlier reaction, she'd expected more resistance. She still thought he was overcompensating for the blow his aunt had delivered, but she pressed on. No, it was my idea. I have a pretty good reason to want you to stay healthy. Then she held up her engagement ring for emphasis. He shrugged the shoulder she wasn't leaning against and said, There's nothing wrong with me. What's the point of spending a bunch of money for some doctor to tell me what I already know? It's not going to cost you anything. Your mum already told me you're on her insurance and she'll pay for anything it doesn't cover. You never know. The whole point of getting a checkup is to catch things you didn't know were wrong early. You know I go twice a year. He sighed. I don't know. I've just never liked doctors. Will you do it for me? Pretty please, she said, and then affected a pout. That's not fair. She could see his resistance faltering and hear it in his voice. As he'd suggested earlier, she decided to bring out the big guns. If you go, I'll give you something much better than a lollipop for being a good boy." "Ella!" he gasped in surprise when she squeezed his manhood through his jeans. Still caressing him in full view of anyone who might look their way, she said, "Just say yes." "Okay, I'll go. Get your phone." A couple of minutes later, he had an appointment for the next day, right after class. As soon as John's name was called and he walked through the door, Ella sent a text to his mother. At the doctor, he just went in. Her response arrived a few seconds later. "Bless you. Did you tell them to lock the back door so he can't sneak out that way and escape?" Ella had to fight hard to hold in her laughter when she read that. She replied, "He won't get very far very fast. I have his phone and the keys to the car." His mother's next message read, "And his heart. Thank you again." A couple of rambunctious children in the waiting room convinced Ella that trying to study wasn't likely to be productive. So, she left her books in the bag and hit the internet on her phone. A page collecting funny postings from all over the internet caught her attention, and the minutes rolled by. Before she knew it, the sound of someone saying John's name caught her attention. She peeked through the reception window and saw him in front of the counter on the other side of the door. Ella put her phone away, slung her purse over her shoulder and stood up. "You're all set to go," the woman at the counter said. "Take this across the street to the lab. We sent over all your information, so check-in shouldn't take long." When he emerged, Ella kept the question she had to herself, but only long enough to exit the building and see that nobody was close by in the parking lot. "What was that about the lab?" she asked. John shrugged and answered, "Just some test the doc was going on about. I said okay so I could get out of there." "What kind of test? Blood work or something?" The sudden flood of colour in his cheeks caught her off guard. "It's nothing important," he answered evasively. Once again she waited. They were only a few steps away from the car, so she held back until they reached that relative haven of privacy. He proved he knew her just as well as she knew him when they both closed their car doors a few seconds later. He let out a resigned sigh, ran his fingers through his brown hair, and told her what he was trying to dance around because he knew he wasn't going to get away with it. "Okay," he began. "My uncles on Dad's side both have low sperm count, so the doctor is trying to get me to go get tested." "That's pretty important, I think," she said, and then laid her hand on his leg. "To both of us. You are going, right?" He let his head thump into the headrest and sighed again. "John. What am I supposed to do? Go over there and tell them I'm there to jack off in a plastic cup?" Ella had only been thinking about it in the abstract, and his words brought home the reality of how the sample was obtained. "Okay, I see your point," she admitted. "Can I see that slip the doctor gave you?" He pulled it out of his pocket and passed it to her. As soon as she looked, she knew that it was of no help. It plainly stated that the doctor was requesting a semen sample. She had hoped it would be written in some sort of medical code. There was no way he was going to be able to walk up to the reception counter and hand over that piece of paper to a woman without dying of embarrassment on the spot. An idea popped in her head. "How about this? You stay here and I'll walk over there and talk to them. Nobody will see you, and if there's anyone we know there, I'll come straight back without saying anything." I guess," he answered with nothing resembling conviction. Ella cupped his cheek in her hand, turned him toward her and kissed him. "Try to relax." He didn't have to say, easier said than done. She could see it in his eyes. Remembering she had his phone, she pulled it out of her purse, brought up the page she'd been reading in the waiting room, and handed it over. "Check this out. It's funny," she told him. "I'll be back in a few minutes." With that, she laid the keys on the center console in case he wanted to roll down the windows or listen to the radio, and climbed out of the car. Upon crossing the road, she observed the lab carefully. She meant to keep her promise. If she saw anyone who knew them, she wasn't going to embarrass him by bringing up the test where they could hear. All was well when she reached the door. She didn't recognize anyone in the waiting room or behind the reception desk, What she had never expected was that she was nervous as she walked up to the counter. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked. "I was wondering if I could speak to someone about a test my fiancé is supposed to take here." "What kind of test?" Ella tapped her fingernails on the counter, trying to come up with an answer for that as her cheeks warmed. A woman in a lab coat stepped in behind the receptionist and said, "I'm one of the technicians. Why don't you come back and we can talk in private?" Relieved, Ella said, "Thank you." The woman pointed and said, "Through that door right there." Ella walked through the door and the woman introduced herself. "I'm Lauren. We can use this consultation room." Ella. "That's a beautiful name." She opened the door to the room and gestured for Ella to enter. "Thank you." The technician closed the door behind them. "Do you have a doctor's order? That might be easier than explaining why you're here." "Yes, it's right here," Ella answered, and retrieved it from her purse. "Ah," Lauren said upon reading the order. "So, do you have questions about the test, or is it a problem with convincing him to take it?" Ella smiled, feeling more at ease, and answered, "Both." "This is going to be a bit embarrassing," she warned. "He should only provide the sample when he's refrained from ejaculating for at least 24 hours. That's the most difficult part for some. Most, really." Ella chuckled when the woman rolled her eyes. She then said, "Yesterday morning, as far as I know. Does he have to, do it here?" "Well, he doesn't necessarily have to provide the sample here, although I would recommend it. I can send the testing materials home with you, but the sample needs to be kept at body temperature and brought in within an hour. In my experience, samples provided here and turned in immediately yield the most accurate results." Ella blew out a slow breath and tried to think of how she was going to convince him to come in. "This isn't the first time this test has proved a little complicated," Lauren said. "You could take the paperwork for him to fill out and bring it back in. Then I could set him up in a room near the side door. That way he won't have to come in through reception at the front. You could bring the sample up to us when he's finished, and then no one would even see him." "That might help," Ella admitted. She thought about it for a moment and asked, "Can someone be in the room with him?" Lauren smiled. "That's not uncommon. There shouldn't be any lubricant or saliva in the sample, though." Ella chuckled and nodded. "I understand." "Sometimes that's the only way it works," Lauren said. "Many men find it difficult to attain an erection in a sterile room of a public building without help." "I guess I'll go let him know and see if I can talk him into it." "Let me get you the paperwork and show you where the room is. Then I'll just have to wish you luck. I'm probably going to need it." A couple of minutes later, Ella walked back across the street with the paperwork in hand. John saw her as she approached, and the look on his face reminded her of a deer caught in the headlights. It wasn't any better when she sat down in the car and held the paperwork out to him. "There's no way I can do this," he said. "Just a second," she said. "You fill the paperwork out and I'll take it back in. I talked to one of the lab technicians and she set up a room near a side door. I can let you in that door so you don't have to go in the front. Then when you're done, you can go right back out that door and no one will ever see you." He shook his head. "It won't work. There's no way I'm going to get hard in a building full of people like that." Ella offered him a coquettish grin and said, "Well, I'm going to help you with that." "What do you mean?" "What do you think I mean? I don't think I'll have any trouble making you hard or making you come if I want to." She dropped her voice into a sultry whisper and added, "And I want to." He stammered, at a loss for words. Ella brought a finger to her lips, pulled a pen from her purse, and then said, "Start signing." John timidly took the pen. As soon as he had it in hand, she started the car. When he finished, Ella checked to make sure he hadn't missed anything, and then drove across the street to the lab. Only one car was parked along the side of the building, and it was far from the door where Ella stopped. She said, "I'm going to take the paperwork in. Watch that door, and when I open it, come in. The room we're going to is only a couple of steps away." He nodded, and she leaned across to kiss his cheek before getting out of the car. Lauren was waiting when Ella arrived inside and opened the door leading into the back. "I'll take care of that," Lauren said, holding out her hand for the paperwork. "So far, so good." "So far," Ella answered. "I hope he's still in the car when I open the door." "Best not to dally then. Here's the sample cup," Lauren said as she handed it over. "Thanks for going out of your way to help." "That's what we're here for." Ella walked down the hall, finding it empty, and peeked into the room before going to the outside door. It looked like any room in a doctor's office. The door could be locked from the inside, which she was sure was crucial for John's peace of mind. Then, she went to get him. He started when she pushed on the bar to open the door, but didn't get out of the car. She emphatically waved him toward her, and he finally reacted. Ella held the door open and then ushered him into the room set aside for them. The look on his face as she locked the door took her aback. He was pale and appeared to be on the verge of getting sick. "Are you okay?" she asked. He shook his head and answered, "No." Ella stepped over to him and gathered him in her arms. He wrapped his around her and surprised her with how tight he was holding her. While caressing his back, she asked, "What is it?" I'm not sure I want to know." "Won't it be better to know than to wonder?" He sighed and said, "I guess." "It will," she said, and then kissed him. The kiss started out soft, comforting. Ever so slowly, she let her hands wander to his lower back and slipped her tongue into the kiss. The familiar rush of arousal set her heart to beating faster, and she could feel the excitement building in his kiss. By the time she stepped back, Ella knew she was soaking wet. Some of the nervousness returned to John's eyes, but it couldn't stand up to his arousal when she pulled her top over her head and tossed it on the exam table behind him. She remained just out of reach as she unclasped her bra and pulled her arms from the straps. He reached down for a quick adjustment, which was a good sign. Ella's bra joined her top. Before it even landed on the paper-covered vinyl, John cupped her heavy breasts in his hands. Ella moaned and slipped a hand in behind his head to tug down. A broken gasp filled her lungs when John took her right nipple between his lips. She reached between his legs with her other hand and could feel him hardening. Quiet moans escaped her as he continued to worship her breasts. Her practiced fingers tugged on his belt, and then opened the clasp. She made short work of the button and zipper of his jeans, allowing her to feel him through the thinner cloth of his boxers. He was already as hard as stone. He grunted around her nipple when she pulled his underwear down, freeing his cock. She squeezed it briefly to feel it throb, and then pushed his jeans down to his thighs. "Take them off," she whispered to him. He gave her nipple one last suckle, and then straightened to pull off his shoes, not bothering to unlace them. While he undressed, she pulled the sample cup out of her purse and removed it from the plastic wrapper. She sat it down on the exam table just as he kicked the denim away. Ella wrapped her fingers around his shaft, looked into his eyes and smiled. He stifled a groan from her touch. She loosed a chuckling moan at his reaction. "I told you I could get you hard." He nodded, breathing heavily. Then she got down to work. John leaned against the table and grunted as her hand slid up and down his shaft. "God, that feels good," he said in a growled whisper. "Uh-huh," she agreed, while adding a twist of the wrist to her strokes. "I like this. Someone could be just a few feet away and have no idea what we're doing in here." "Don't remind me." She stuck her tongue out at him and grinned. Ella kept up the slow pace, drawing grunts and gasps from him that he seemed to have more trouble controlling by the moment. He squeezed her breasts and watched them jiggle from the motion of her hand on occasion. Though most of the time he was caught up in the desire smouldering in her eyes. She was so turned on that she had to forego tickling his balls with her other hand to reach between her legs to assuage the growing ache. The moment she whimpered from her touch, his eyes lit up. When he tugged on her shorts, Ella quickly helped him pull them down. The shorts pulled at her feet, but her panties only made it far enough to stretch between her thighs. She clamped her lips tight to stave off a yelp when he pushed a finger deep into her canal. A second finger joined the first to pump into her depths. Ella whimpered, squeezing him tight when the pleasure shot up her spine and exploded into her every nerve ending. As soon as the wave passed and she could loosen her grip, she picked up the pace of her stroking hand. John began to breathe heavily, his fingers losing their rhythm. The sound mingled with her pants and the fap of her hand sliding over the ridge of his cockhead, filling the quiet room. Caught up in the sexual energy, she nearly forgot the whole purpose of their risky tryst. "I'm getting close," he grunted, snapping her out of an aroused trance. It was with the greatest of reluctance that she stepped away from his wonderful fingers and reached for the sample cup. She could see it in his face, hear it in his breathing, and feel it in his throbbing cock. He was near the edge. She positioned the plastic container over the head of his cock and pulled down on the rigid organ to straighten it. Her voice husky, she said, "Come for me." After a few more fast strokes, she said it again. "Come for me. Give it to me." "Ah, baby," he growled. "Here come." That was as far as he got. He lurched, and his cream spattered audibly against the bottom of the plastic cup. Ella held him tight, keeping him aimed into the cup, and twisted her hand around the swollen organ. Spurt after spurt pattered on the plastic as he fought to remain still and upright. When a gentle ooze rolled over the head, Ella said, "That's enough for them," and dropped to her knees. Once there, she simultaneously sat the cup down on the floor and took him in her mouth. The moment her lips wrapped around him, he let out an explosive gasp and offered up one last bittersweet blast of cum. He went weak in the knees as Ella moaned and sucked him dry, down to the last fitful dribble. When she let him slowly slip from her lips, he turned and leaned heavily on the paper-covered table, setting off a loud crackle. A sensual chuckle bubbled up inside Ella as she licked her lips and watched him fight to keep his legs under him. She scooped up the cup and stood, pulling her shorts with her, and feeling a chill as the breeze from her motion touched the wetness between her legs. She sat the cup down on the far end of the table from where John trembled and twitched, so she could finish pulling on her shorts and panties. Still bare-breasted, she put the lid on the cup and then pulled out the labels the technician had provided. Once the sample was secure, she laid a hand on her man's back and caressed it. "You okay?" she asked. "Oh God, Ella," he muttered. Good, huh? I know you tasted good." That set off a full-body shiver in him. "Come on, John, we need to get dressed so I can drop this off and we can get home," Ella said. She then leaned in close and whispered, "There's more where that came from." Not surprisingly, that motivated him. Ella peeked into the bedroom after getting out of the shower that evening to see John was out like a light. Considering he'd provided his third donation of the day an hour or so before, it was hardly a mystery as to why. Still riding the euphoria of her most recent orgasm, Ella tapped on her phone before drying her hair. No messages had arrived during her shower, but she started when the phone rang before she could remove her finger from the screen. She pulled the towel turban on her head away from her right ear, and then answered, "Hi, Dad." "Hey, honey. I'm not waking you, am I?" "No, I just got out of the shower. What's up?" "Listen, I thought I'd let you know what I found out about the campground. Unfortunately, there's not a lot I can do." Ella sighed and asked, "Too much red tape?" "The opposite, really. Because of the circumstances, everyone involved has been stalling the foreclosure process as much as possible. They're running out of red tape to slow things down. The biggest problem is that the church can't legally negotiate a payment plan. Otherwise, they'd be golden. From what I hear, they've raised over half the money." "Would have been more if they'd taken ours," Ella grumbled. "Close to what they need," her father acknowledged. "But that's neither here nor there. As it stands, the property owner, Ms. Welker, is the only one who can legally negotiate a deal." "Is there any chance of that?" "I'm afraid not. She's in the Devon Center Hospice, suffering from dementia. Since she didn't have any surviving family, she'd made preparations for something like this. but the property tax on the campground was one thing she forgot. That was that. Well, thanks for trying. Oh, I'm not done yet, he said, and she knew he was smiling from the tone of his voice. I'm calling in a few favours to see if I can have the campground folded into the state forest after a foreclosure. The property is on the border of the forest anyway, and at least that way it won't end up on the public auction block. What do you think the chances are? A lot better than average, he confidently replied. Cross your fingers and keep your hopes up. Now, I'll let you go so you can get some rest. They said their goodbyes, and Ella saw herself smiling in the mirror. She knew what kind of connections her father had, and that he never sugar-coated things for her. If he believed he could do it, then he could. Just in case, she crossed her fingers for a second before picking up the hairdryer. 8 o'clock, John promised, standing next to the car after the last class the following day. In the door by 8 o'clock, Ella reiterated. I know how you get when you're playing D&D. Tell my brother he's in just as much trouble as you are if you're not home on time. He held up his hand and said, Promise. Dale said your mum told him 7 anyway. Okay, Ella said, and then kissed him. I love you. Love you too. Ella shook her head and rolled her eyes as John hurried to her brother's car. She'd never understand the game, but she knew how much he loved it, so she didn't argue about him playing. In moderation anyway. She climbed into her car and tried to think of something to do for an hour or so. She knew her sister, and the looks Tara had been giving Nathan before they left strongly hinted that she would hear things she didn't want to if she went straight home. Nothing was really coming to her, though. She was on the verge of going to watch her brother's game when she reached the city limits and a sign caught her eye. So Ella pursed her lips in thought as she neared the turn to the hospice. The thought of the woman being there with no family to come visit tugged at her heartstrings. She had no idea if anyone would let her in, but she made the turn anyway. Can I help you? The woman at the reception desk in the lobby asked as Ella approached. I was wondering if I could see Ms. Welker. Are you family? No, A nurse standing nearby asked. From the church? Not exactly, Ella answered. That's how I know her, though. You do know about her condition, don't you? The nurse asked. Ella nodded. I just wanted to visit with her for a few minutes. The nurse gestured behind her. She's out back enjoying the sunshine. She's always much more lucid when she's outdoors. I was just about to take her some iced tea if you'd like to come along. Thank you, Ella said as she followed. My name is Ella. Christine, the nurse said. Penelope doesn't get many visitors. Her condition causes her to say things that are difficult for people from the church to handle, and that's really all she has left. Her language can be salty, and sometimes she talks about outrageous things. I'm not easily offended. Christine smiled. That's good because she has her days sometimes. She stopped in front of a door and said, Let me get the tea. I'll be right back. Ella noticed how quiet the building was and thought of her phone. She pulled it out of her purse and set it to silent, not wanting one of her ringtones to suddenly intrude on the quiet. The vibration was strong enough to feel through the strap of her purse anyway. By the time she put her phone away, the nurse had returned. I bring it from home, Christine explained. Penelope knows her tea and she's not fond of what we make here. That's nice of you, Ella said as they set out through the halls again. Anything to make the residents more comfortable? Oh, don't be surprised if she calls me Wendy. I can only assume it's a nurse from her past that I resemble. She may call you by someone else's name too. I usually play along and don't say anything too specific. Oh, and call her Penelope. Calling her Ms. Welker usually results in a bad spell. I understand. Christine led them out the back door of the facility and pointed. There she is. Penelope sat on a park bench, looking out over the manicured lawn towards some trees beyond. Her hair was completely white, and her wrinkles gave her a distinguished, wise appearance. She was smiling and toying with a walking cane leaned against the bench at her side. Another nurse sat on a nearby bench, keeping an eye on her. Let me go first, Stay a few feet behind the bench and I'll introduce you. Okay, Ella agreed and then followed the nurse across the lawn. Here's your tea, Penelope, Christine said when she stepped in front of the bench. Oh, bless you, dear, the old woman said as she took the glass in a reasonably steady hand. She brought it to her lips, sipped, and then let out a satisfied sigh. Thank heavens you know how to brew tea. Everyone else must make it with toilet water. Christine laughed and said, You're welcome. There's someone here who would like to visit with you if that's all right. Oh, who is it? Christine waved for Ella to approach. Her name is Ella, and she knows you through the church. Ella. That doesn't sound familiar, Penelope mused. That's okay, Penelope. I'm sure it will come to you. Here she is. Hello, Penelope, Ella said, and offered a wave. The old woman's eyes widened and she gasped. The glass fell from her nerveless fingers, spilling tea all over her lap and the bench. She put her other hand over her heart and reached out with the hand that had held the glass. Zantwiller. Oh, it's been so long, Penelope said. Ella's heart nearly stopped upon hearing the Zan that preceded her real name and that of every other female member of the family. The wizened woman continued. You've come back. I've missed you so much. Where have you? She trailed off, and then suddenly shrank back against the bench. No, it can't be. You're gone. The fire. Your hair. Your hair isn't green. It's not you. Oh, it's not you. Ella was both stunned and heartbroken. She had no idea what to say as the old woman's chin dropped to her chest and she began to weep. She jumped when Christine laid a hand on her shoulder. I'm sorry, Ella said, still at a loss. It's okay. You just triggered some memory or fantasy of hers, Christine whispered. You should probably go, but you didn't do anything wrong. Don't worry, she'll be fine in a few minutes. I'm sorry, Ella said again. Christine clasped her hand for a second and said, Don't be. She then sat down on the bench and reached for the old woman's hand. Ella turned to walk across the lawn, shaking and ashamed. As she neared the door, the memory of Penelope mentioning green hair hit her hard. There was no missing the significance of that, and the name the woman had called her. Sometime in the past, Penelope had known a dryad. There was only one person who could possibly tell her what that meant. Zantina stood waiting at the edge of her pool when Ella arrived. The dryad held out her hands. Come, Zanella, I know what you seek. So, she did know a dryad? Ella asked, as she pulled her purse off her shoulder to undress. Yes, Zantina answered, and Ella saw a rare hint of longing in the nymph's sparkling eyes. Come, I will show you. Though not as deeply aware of her great-grandmother's thoughts as the dryad was of hers, she could sense that Zantina didn't want to wait for her to undress. So, she pulled her purse back onto her shoulder and went to take the dryad's golden hands. Close your eyes, Zantina said. Ella did so, knowing that it meant her great-grandmother was going to magically take them elsewhere. Like almost every other member of the family, she'd peeked once when travelling this way, and regretted it. The whirl of green and brown along with the sudden change of location had left her nauseous and dizzy. A sensation of floating and dew settling on her skin marked Zantina's magic taking hold. In the space of a heartbeat, they were somewhere else. We are here, Zantina said. Ella could feel the familiar touch of magic that permeated the woods near her home, but it was subtly different. She opened her eyes to see cabins nestled amidst trees in the distance. She stood just within a much denser forest. Is that the campground? She asked. Zantina nodded. Here is my sister Zantwilla's place. Ella followed the dryad's gaze and saw the stump of a tree. From the size of the stump, she knew the tree had been massive. 2 people couldn't have wrapped their arms around it. It was hollow on the inside and blackened, as if touched by fire. She has returned to the earth, Zantina explained. I'm sorry. The dryad shook her head and smiled. It is no thing of sadness. She gave all of her great magic and all of her life to protect this place. She did so with joy, knowing what would continue after her. The forest? Ella guessed. And all who call this their place? Ella asked. Was it the fire? I read about how there was a fire here set by someone. Is that what happened to her? Yes. The fire fed upon the dry summer grasses and flew before the wind. It came, but my sister would not let it touch her place. She knew it would mean her passing to take the fire's hunger. But those she protected would remain to sing of her life in this place. That was when Ella heard it. In truth, she felt more than heard the song that flitted upon the wind. It was like the tinkling of tiny bells, and the sound gave her chills. She turned, and the music grew louder. Though there was no sign of the source, she knew it was somewhere ahead. She took a step toward the music, but then looked to her great-grandmother before going any further. Xantina nodded and gestured as if she was pushing Ella toward the sound. Slowly, tentatively, she walked toward where she could feel the music. She parted the dangling branches of the weeping willow in front of her and stepped beneath. Somewhere in the back of her head, she knew the tree was out of place in the mixed forest of pine, maple, and oaks, but it seemed unimportant as the tinkling music grew louder. Ella walked around the tree and then froze in place to stare in astounded wonder. Even a girl raised in a family descended from a dryad could be surprised by a ring of orange mushrooms and 3 fairies. This is the reason my sister gave all of herself, Xantina explained. There are so few fairy rings left in this world, and they are precious. Giggles joined the otherworldly music, and the fairies darted toward Ella. Her great-grandmother stepped in next to her and held up a hand. 2 of the fairies alighted on her palm. Ella imitated the dryad's action, and the 3rd fairy chose her as its perch. She could barely feel the weight of the 5-inch-high woman on her palm. The creature was petite and wore a diaphanous gown that did nothing to hide the perfect body beneath. The fairy's translucent wings shimmered with all the colours of the rainbow and were veined in gold. Her hair was of the palest blonde, and Ella could see the points of elvish ears peeking through the white gold locks. The fairy smiled at her and waved in a very human gesture. Xantina spoke to the pair of fey creatures standing on her palm in a language Ella didn't understand, but felt as if she should have. One of the fairies answered, and her voice was like the barely heard rapid tweeting of a bird somewhere in the distance. They ask that you keep their secret for now, even from your sister, Xantina said. You must say the promise. I promise I won't tell anyone, Ella said, and then gave a brief shrug. I can't promise it won't drive me crazy, though. All 3 fairies and the dryad giggled. With that, the tiny creatures took flight and landed within the circle of mushrooms. The moment their feet touched the carpet of leaves and twigs, the fairies vanished. Come, Xantina said, and took Ella's hand to lead her back through the dangling branches. Why do we have to keep them a secret? Ella asked while looking back over her shoulder at the fairy ring. They must speak with their queen. You will not have to keep the secret long. It's a good thing. I feel like I'm going to burst. Their magic will help. It is the nature of fairies to hide. Their memories hide too. You will remember, but the magic will help you keep your promise. And the farther they walked from the willow and the circle beneath, the more Ella knew it was true. Trying to think about the fairies was becoming difficult. Before it slipped too far away, she asked, did Penelope know them too? One visited with her when she was a child, though she would not remember. My sister was her friend, and remained so until she rejoined the earth. This was the one sadness Xantwilla felt in her passing. She knew it would bring sadness to her friend. They reached the stump as Xantina finished. Ella asked, is it fairy magic I feel here? It is my sister's magic. So strong was her love for her place that part of her is here still. It is in the leaves and the rocks and the soil, everywhere. That is what Penelope seeks when she goes outside. And she finds it, because my sister's love follows her too." Ella sighed. It broke my heart when she thought I was Zantwilla. It should not be so. Though she was sad, there was more. She smiles now. You gave her a beautiful memory of my sister. Really? Zantina nodded and giggled. Yes, and you will give her more. What do you mean, Grandma? You will see. Close your eyes. Ella took her great-grandmother's hands and closed her eyes as instructed. She knew the Dryad was up to something, and knew just as well that she would never know what it was until Zantina wanted her to. The one thing that kept the capricious games from becoming intolerable was that whatever the nymph had in store would undoubtedly be wonderful. It always was. When Ella opened her eyes within Zantina's wood once more, a buzzing sensation at her side perplexed her. It was only then that she remembered her phone was still silenced. When she pulled it out, she was shocked to see that hours had passed. We touched the fairy world near the circle. Time is different there. Zantina answered the unspoken question. Your mate seeks you. Go, and give him beautiful memories too. Ella looked at her phone again, and saw a message from John that read, I'm home on time. Now where are you? When she looked back up to thank the Dryad, she found that her great-grandmother had vanished somewhere. Despite the nymph's absence, she said, Thank you, Grandma. A warm surge in the magic surrounding her let her know the message had been heard. Ella was thankful for the fairy magic. As her great-grandmother had explained, she remembered the encounter, but it only drifted at the edge of her thoughts. Trying to keep the secret, especially from her twin, or do much of anything would have been impossible if she still felt the giddy wonder that the fairies had inspired. She still needed to confirm something else the Dryad had told her, though. John was going to game with her brother after class the next day, so she decided to stop at the hospice on the way home from campus. She asked for Christine when she arrived, and the nurse walked into the lobby a few minutes later. Hello, Ella, what can I do for you? I was wondering how Penelope is doing. Christine smiled. She's doing just fine. She's surprisingly happy, as a matter of fact. Really? Ella asked as she broke out into a smile as well. Yes. There's no need to worry. Did she know you well? No, Ella answered. I only know her through someone else. That's surprising. She usually only has a good spell like this when her closest friends come to visit. Well, I'm glad to hear it, Ella said, relieved by the confirmation of her great-grandmother's words. I won't take up any more of your time. Christine waved her hand in a dismissive gesture. Not at all. Penelope is one of my favourite residents. Would you like to peek in on her? I probably shouldn't, Ella said. No matter how the previous visit had turned out, the woman's initial reaction to her had been heart-wrenching. Nonsense. Come out back while I take out her tea. I think you'll see what I mean. Made curious by the nurse's suggestion, Ella asked, If you think it's okay? You can stay by the door if you'd like, but come see how she's doing for your peace of mind. Though apprehensive, Ella followed the nurse through the building and then out the back door. Penelope was sitting on the same bench, but the difference in her demeanour was visible from the instant Ella saw her. Her smile was broader, more joyful. Rather than staring off into the distance, she was enjoying the entire vista of her surroundings. There, Christine said. You see? Ella nodded, and she could feel the strain in her cheeks from the grin on her face. Yes, thank you. You're welcome. Now, I'd better get this over to her before I jinx it. Wouldn't want that. No, we would not, Christine agreed as she carried Penelope her tea. Ella left the hospice in a buoyant mood and decided it was time to try the recipe for twice-baked potatoes that John's mother had given her. She refused to let the flyer it was written on bring her down, and took a measure of satisfaction in shredding it once she'd copied it onto an index card. The compliments from her sister and Nathan kept her riding high, but it was John's pronouncement that it was just as good as his mother's that truly sent her flying. As the hour grew late, Ella turned her thoughts to sharing some of her exuberance in the bedroom. She picked out an especially short and gauzy nightgown, paired it with panties so thin as to be nearly invisible, and crawled into bed. When her initial playful flirtation didn't turn out as expected, she could see something in John's eyes and asked, "What's wrong?" "Nothing," he answered. "Just tired, I guess." Ella lifted her eyebrows and put a hand on her hip, fixing him with a stare that spoke volumes. He was wise enough to get the message and didn't try to continue the charade. It's my aunt's birthday. I've been trying not to think about it. I always call her, and..." He trailed off and sighed. "Do you want to?" she asked. "No," he quickly answered. "I'm not a glutton for punishment. It just doesn't feel right." Ella scooted in close and took his hand. "It isn't right, but that's not your fault." "I know. Sorry I'm letting it get to me. You look so sexy, and I haven't said anything." "Never mind that," Ella said. She snuggled up next to him, rested her head on his shoulder, and caressed his side. Though her original plan was to relax him, and then try again to coax him into making love to her, it was hardly disappointing to cuddle with him and drift slowly to sleep instead. John was still a little down when the alarm woke them up in the morning, but Ella could tell he was doing his best to move on. Whenever she smiled, touched him in passing, or held his hand, he always brightened, which made her heart sing. She considered asking him to skip class so they could spend the day together, but it was nearly the weekend. There was no sense in potentially missing an important lecture when they would both be free in another 8 hours or so. By the time she was taking notes in her last class of the day, she'd planned what she was going to wear and make for dinner. She had some notions about what to do with the rest of the night, but she knew to play that by ear. Her phone rattled against the compact in her purse near the end of the hour, so she checked it and discovered a message from Nathan. "What's up? John's not here." Ella's brow furrowed and she tapped in a reply. "He should be. Let me text him." Nathan's next message came through before she could hit send on hers, though. "Tried to text. He's not answering." Ella went from confused to concerned in nothing flat. She sent the message to Nathan and then typed one to John. "Nate says you're not there. Text me back." She waited a minute and then sent a follow-up message of, "Hello?" "Any luck?" Nathan asked. "Not yet," she replied. "Saw him right before class. He had a phone call, so I went ahead while he answered it. Then he never came in." Everyone got up when the professor called an end for the day. Ella decided against texting and called instead. After 4 rings, his phone went to voicemail. She immediately called him back. This time, he picked up just before the voicemail. "Where are you? I'm worried sick," she blurted out as soon as he said hello. "Sorry. I took a cab to Mum's and got my bike. I had to pull over to answer the phone." "Why didn't you let me and Nathan know? He's worried about you too because you didn't show up in class." "Can you let him know everything's okay?" "That would be lying," Ella responded. "What's going on?" "I just need to figure something out." "Where are you? I know you don't want to talk about whatever this is on the phone." He paused for a moment and then answered, "Almost to the house. I pulled over in Geraldine's parking lot." "Okay, I'll be home in just a little." He cut her off by saying, "Ella, I need some time to think." "What do you mean?" I need to be alone for a while. I'm going to grab some gear and camp out tonight." "Where?" The sound of his voice betrayed how hard it was for him to say. "Ella, please." "I just want to be here for you," she said with her heart sinking. "I know. I'll call you before I go to sleep tonight. Okay? I need some time, baby." Her eyes welling up with tears, she said, "I love you. I wish you'd wait for me at home." "I love you too, but I can't right now. I'll call you." "You'd better," she warned. "I will. Bye." "Bye," she said as a tear rolled down her cheek. As soon as she ended the call, she saw another text message from Nathan that read, "Tried to call, but he didn't pick up." She sent a message back saying, "Talk to him. He's not hurt or anything." A second later, she heard his message tone coming from behind her. "Everything okay?" Nathan asked as he walked up with Tara. Ella answered, "No, but..." "It's something you can't talk about right now," her sister finished for her. Ella nodded. "Going home?" Tara asked. "Yes, I guess." Tara touched her sister's cheek and said, "We'll follow you. You know we're here if you need us, right?" "I know." As little as she wanted to admit it, she empathized with how John felt. She didn't want to talk to anyone either. Her sister understood that and led Nathan to their car as soon as Ella acknowledged the offer. She suspected Tara was just as torn as she was, though. Hoping that John would reconsider, she got in the car to head home. It took a tremendous amount of willpower to accelerate at a smooth pace and maintain an even speed, something she usually did without thought. Every fibre of her being was screaming for her to hurry, in hopes of catching her fiancé before he left the house. Even though she expected it, not seeing John's motorcycle parked in the driveway caused her shoulders to slump. She shut off the car and leaned her head against the steering wheel to wonder where he was. It was then that she decided there was someone she wanted to talk to. Tara pulled in next to her, and Ella waited for her sister to get out before saying, "I'm going to see Grandma." Her sister nodded and offered a half smile. The peaceful aura of the wood had always helped them sort through their emotions. When that was coupled with the wisdom of their great-grandmother, it was a powerful thing indeed. It wasn't what Ella had planned, but it was what her sister expected. The sights, sounds, and smells were lost on her as she hurried down the trail with dry leaves crunching underfoot. She brushed aside the low-hanging branches and undergrowth with single-minded purpose, pushing on to the clearing in the centre of the wood. Her great-grandparents were waiting for her when she arrived. "Zanella, now is not the time," the dryad said. "A man needs time to sort himself out sometimes," her great-grandfather added. Ella felt stifled, claustrophobic. The moment she pulled her blouse over her head, the feeling ebbed by a small measure. As she undressed, she said, "I'm worried about him." Xantina assured her, "He is safe. My magic watches him." "So you know where he is?" The dryad nodded but said, "I will not take you." "Why not?" Ella asked while tossing the shoe she'd just removed into the ferns. Daniel took his mate's hand. "Ella, he needs to find out what's in his own heart right now. I know it's hard to understand, but you're only going to make that harder." "You're right, I don't understand," Ella said with far more irritation than she'd realised was welling up within her. Embarrassed by the outburst, she looked down to pull off her sock and then lifted the other foot to remove her shoe. In her peripheral vision, she saw the nymph kneel down next to the water. She remained silent and tried to regain some measure of composure until she removed the last of her clothing. "Come, I will show him to you," Xantina said. Ella walked over to the pool and then knelt down at her great-grandmother's prompting. Once she was settled, Xantina touched the surface of the water with one finger. Ripples radiated out, racing toward the edges of the pool. When the waves hit the opposite shore, they rebounded. In their wake, the water took on a silvery appearance, reflecting the sky and canopy above. The mirrored surface closed in on the ever-shrinking circle of clear water, and then absorbed it. The reflection wavered as Ella watched. At first, it blurred. A few seconds later, the image was little more than blotches of blue and green. Those random spots of colour then coalesced, and she saw John sit down on the edge of a lake. His expression was haunted, and his eyes distant. "Grandma, please take me to him," Ella implored, her heart breaking from the sight of him in pain. "You are with him, Zanella. You are always with him." "That's not the same." "No, it is more. Reach out to him." When Ella hesitated, Xantina encouraged her. "Go on." Not really understanding, Ella held out her hand over the water as if to touch his right shoulder. She wanted nothing more at that moment than to truly be there to comfort him. To her amazement, he twitched in surprise, looked at his right shoulder, and then laid his own hand there for a moment. "Is it your magic?" Ella asked. "It is yours," the Dryad answered. She put her hand over her heart and said, "From here." Ella imagined she was sitting in front of him, caressing his cheek and looking into his eyes. His expression softened, if not by much, and he sighed. Santina caressed Ella's hair and said, "Stay here this night. Watch over him. Hold him in your heart. He will find his way." She could think of nothing else. Ella awakened with her head resting on a hummock of moss. Though beads of dew decorated her skin, she was warm, comfortable, and reluctant to rise. Birdsong and the soft gurgle of the spring that fed her great-grandmother's pool further conspired to lull her back to sleep. In time she roused to find Santina watching over her. "Good morning, Zanella." "Morning," Ella responded. She sat up and stretched out of habit, though her bed of moss and leaves had been every bit as comfortable as her mattress in the house. She hadn't eaten anything or answered the call of nature the night before, but neither troubled her. With wakefulness, her reason for spending the night in the wood did trouble her, though. "He sleeps still," Santina said, knowing what was in her heart. Ella joined the Dryad at the edge of the pool and let her feet dangle in the water. "I don't remember falling asleep. Is he doing okay?" "He is warm, safe, and loved, but he is not ready to see you yet." Ella sighed. She looked out over the pool, thinking of him and opening her heart to bring him comfort as she had the day before. Movement in the corner of her eye caused her to glance that way, and she saw her clothing was hanging from branches in the sunlight. From the way the cloth fluttered in the wind, it appeared to be dry. "Thanks, Grandma." The Dryad offered an impish grin and said, "You will need them soon." "John?" Ella asked, hoping. "Soon," Santina said, "but first there is another." "Another?" Santina said, and then giggled. "Take my hand." Once again they flew on the wings of the Dryad's magic and arrived at a familiar place. There was no holding back her grin of wonder when Ella saw the three fairies hovering near the place where Zantwilla's tree had once stood. One flew to her, and something that was more a suggestion than a thought caused her to lift her hand as she had before. The fairy alighted on her palm. It appeared to be the same one that had chosen her on their last visit, though she couldn't be sure. The fairy spoke, her voice emerging not only from her lips, but within Ella's head as well. "The words of humans are hard, and it has been long. You understand me?" "Yes, I understand you," Ella answered. "Good. We have a gift for Penny." Santina explained. "Penelope was called Penny when she was small. Penny was my friend, and it makes me sad to know she is ill. Look here." In a fluttering of wings, the fairy left Ella's palm and landed within the hollow stump. There she saw a leaf unlike anything she'd ever seen before. It was larger than her hand, curled into the shape of a bowl, and tapered to a rounded point opposite the stem. Within was what looked like water, except it twinkled with points of multicoloured light. "This will make her better," the fairy declared. "She's very sick," Ella said, knowing the seriousness of dementia. The fairy laughed and nonchalantly said, "It is magic." Santina assured her. "She is right, Zanella. The water comes from the fairy world. It is blessed by their magic and by the magic of my sister, who loved Penelope as I do you. It will take her pain and return her memories for the time she has left." "For the time she has left?" Ella asked. "Her spirit is weary and longs to fly free," the fairy said. Ella asked, "So, she's going to die?" Her great-grandmother nodded. "It is her time to return to the earth. The magic will let her say goodbye to those she loves, then pass in peace and joy." She had every reason to believe the Dryad, and felt her previously heavy heart lighten, but that wasn't her only concern. How do I carry it without spilling it? I don't know how I could give it to her. They'll look at me like I'm crazy at the hospice if I tiptoe in with a leaf full of water. Her great-grandmother answered the first by kneeling down and picking up the leaf. She turned it nearly on its side, and while the liquid shifted toward the pull of gravity, it did not roll off the leaf. The dryad then stood and handed it to Ella. Ella twisted her wrist, amused by the way the water jiggled. Okay, but that doesn't solve the problem of giving it to her. The fairy flew in close and asked, "May I look into your thoughts?" For anyone else, it would likely have been a frightening question. Ella, however, had grown up with her twin, sharing a near psychic connection, and with a great-grandmother who knew everything. She nodded without the slightest hint of hesitation. The fairy closed her eyes, and her tiny brow knitted in concentration. Only moments passed before her eyes shot open and she clapped. "Tea!" the fairy declared. Well, she would drink it. I still don't know how I get it in her tea. There are rules, and... Ella shrugged, unsure how to explain to the fairy. "Put it in first," Santina suggested. "Take the tea to her." "I don't think that will go over any better. I'm not family or anything." The nymph smiled and said, "Christine, have her taste it. She will take it to Penelope, and it will help her too." "Her too?" "You will see," the ever-mischievous dryad said. She still wasn't so sure, but said, "I guess it won't hurt to try." "Thank you," the fairy said. "You can tell your family about us now." "Thank you, I will." The fairy waved and then darted over to join the other tiny winged women. All three then flew away and through the rustling branches of the willow tree. Ella balanced the leaf in her right hand and held out her left. "I guess I have tea to make," she told her great-grandmother. Santina laughed and whisked them home. "Back again?" Christine asked when she walked into the lobby of the hospice. "Yes," Ella answered. She had an irrational, nervous feeling, as if she was trying to smuggle a cake containing a hacksaw to an inmate. "Penelope is doing fine," the nurse said. She looked as if she was about to say something else, but her brow knitted and she winced. Ella asked, "Are you okay?" Christine held a hand over her lower abdomen and whispered, "Cramps." She then nodded at the thermos Ella was carrying and asked, "What's that?" "I made some tea. It's all organic with lemon zest. I thought Penelope might like it." The look on the nurse's face confirmed to Ella that what she'd told her great-grandmother was correct. It wasn't going to be as easy as handing over the thermos and calling it a day. "Penelope is pretty particular about her tea," Christine diplomatically said. Ella held out the thermos and suggested, "Try some and see what you think." She did her best to hide it, but Ella knew the nurse was merely humouring her, and likely trying to think of the most polite way to say she couldn't take the tea to her elderly patient. She took off the top, poured a little, and brought it to her lips for a sip. Her eyes widened, and she immediately sipped again. This time, she shivered and moaned. "Is it good?" Ella asked. "Oh my God," the nurse said, and then stepped closer to whisper, "Good? This is wonderful." Ella chuckled. "Thanks. So, do you think Penelope will like it?" "I know she will. I'm not really supposed to do this, but you went to all this trouble and I think it will brighten her day. If anyone asks, I'll just pretend I used a different thermos today. I don't usually take her tea until later, but..." "No," Ella said while giving a shake of her head. "Don't change her routine. I'll pick up the thermos some other day. I need to get home." "I don't work Mondays and Tuesdays. That's my weekend. You can come by any other day and pick it up. And if you want to bring some more, feel free." "Thanks. I'll come by tomorrow." "Thank you. And I'll say the same for Penelope in advance. I know she would want to." "You're welcome. Bye." Ella left the hospice smiling, but with the happy task out of the way, she was eager to return to the Dryad's pool. The drive felt as if it took hours, and she didn't even bother grabbing her purse from the passenger seat when she arrived at home. She hurried down the trail and found her great-grandmother waiting for her. Is he awake yet? Ella asked while pulling up her top. Surprisingly, Xantina said, Leave your coverings. Yes, he is awake, and he is ready to see you. So he's coming home? The Dryad shook her head. I will take you to him. That was perfectly fine with Ella. She stepped closer, held out her hands, and closed her eyes. The Dryad grasped one, but reached up to caress Ella's cheek with the other. You must be strong, Zanella, Xantina said. Before the advice could sink in, Ella felt the magic take hold of her. In the instant her feet touched solid ground once more, the Dryad let go of her hand. By the time Ella opened her eyes, her great-grandmother had vanished. In front of her, John was pacing near his packed-up gear. He reached the end of a circuit, turned, and started when he saw her. Grandma brought me, Ella explained as she approached. I was worried about you. She saw him wince and he said, Ella, I don't want to do this here. Do what? Talk to me, John. He trailed off, sighed, and then sat down on the ground. Ella knelt down in front of him and asked, What's wrong? Just tell me. You may be sorry you asked, he muttered. Irritation crept in with her concern and she asked, What's that supposed to mean? Sorry, he said, catching the change in her inflection. I just meant it's not good news and I don't know how to tell you. Then just tell me. It can't be worse than the 1,000 crazy things I've thought of since you vanished on me. He leaned to the side and unzipped his backpack, from which he retrieved a sheaf of folded papers. When he held them out to her, Ella took them and read. She saw the name of the clinic and knew that they were the results of his test. Most of the information was too technical to tell her anything, but some listed percentages were very low. There was also a recommendation to retake the test after a longer period of abstention. When she looked up from the paperwork, John said, I told the doctor to give it to me straight. He said that based on that test, there's not much chance I'll ever be able to have kids. The revelation hit Ella hard. She'd never had any vision of her future that didn't include children. Now, here was the man she wanted to spend the rest of her life with, telling her it might never be. It would be difficult enough for a normal couple, but the members of her family could only conceive on Earth Day, making it all the more unlikely. She reeled from the confusing riot of thoughts swirling through her head. Sorry, John said. Latching onto one thing that offered hope, she said. They want you to take the test again. That means they're not sure. I'll take it again, but you shouldn't get your hopes up. Just mine? She asked. I wasn't even sure I wanted kids, but now that they're telling me I can't. He paused and sighed. I knew about my uncles. I think maybe I was trying to convince myself I didn't want kids so I wouldn't be disappointed. So you do? He nodded and said, Yeah, I do. That's why I couldn't figure out any good way to tell you. I can't handle it. How are you supposed to? I don't know, she admitted. It makes me think it's a sign or something. I mean this, and my aunt. Maybe you'd be better off with someone else. Ella shook her head. Don't say that. You don't deserve any of this. Neither do you. Maybe you should think about it. No, she said before he even finished. One thing I do know is that it doesn't change how I feel about you. None of it. I don't need to think about it. I love you. That's all that matters. She could see the relief in his eyes. Even if he believed what he was saying, it wasn't what he wanted. I love you too, he said. Before he could add a but to that, she said, That's all we need then. If we can't have kids, so be it. Are you sure? As soon as he finished the question, she knew the answer. No matter the shock and turmoil she felt, her answer was certain. Yes. I don't care if we haven't exchanged vows yet. Sickness and in health, richer or poorer, it's how I feel. A slight, shy smile turned up the corners of his lips when he said, Me too. The strangest thought hit her out of the blue, and it broke through the tension she felt, so she shared it. If we can't have kids, Tara will use it as an excuse to fill up all the extra bedrooms herself anyway. He chuckled and agreed. You're probably right. I know I'm right. I'd probably do the same thing if the situation were reversed, but that's just a what if. Ella scooted closer. You still have to take the test again, and there are other options. You're not supposed to be getting your hopes up, he reminded her. And you shouldn't be giving up. If we want it badly enough, we can make it happen. He reached up and touched her cheek. You make me want to believe that. Good. Now just get rid of that want to part and believe it. Ella leaned in, and they kissed. When their lips parted, she said, Let's go home. Morning, Ella said when John awakened the next morning. She smiled and giggled at his reaction to her fingertips gliding over his morning erection. Morning, he said. Then he did something completely unexpected and pushed her hand away. Upon seeing the look in her eyes, he reminded her, The test. I wasn't really doing anything, she protested. We weren't last night either. She had to admit he was right. They had climbed into bed, shared an innocent goodnight kiss, and snuggled up together. An accidental brush of his hand over her nipple began a chain of escalating arousal that reached an inevitable conclusion. Okay, I'll behave, she said as she pushed the covers aside. I'm going to brush my teeth. I can at least have a kiss, can't I? He nodded as he kicked his side of the bedclothes down. After brushing their teeth, Ella got her kiss. She couldn't resist tickling him with her tongue and felt his hands slide down to her butt. Her heart beat fast from the touch, and she moaned into the kiss. Then he pulled away. His voice was pained when he said, Ella. She held back a surge of frustration. Sorry. If I'm going to go 3 days, I don't think I can do it here, he said. Ella opened her mouth to protest, but before a word could escape, her conscience told her the truth. She couldn't resist the temptation. All it had taken was a kiss to make her ache for him. He continued, I think I should go stay at Mum's. If I'm going to make it, staying there is the best bet. Ella nodded in resignation. She didn't like it, but she knew he was right. I'll go get you some clothes so you can get dressed in here. I love you. And I do want you. You know that, don't you? I want you too. You're right. There's no way we can behave for 1 day, let alone 3. She blew him a kiss on the way out of the bathroom. Ella sighed as John closed the front door at his mother's house. She knew it was going to be a long 3 days. Already missing him, she backed out of the drive and hit the road. The one and only positive was that she had an opportunity to stop by the hospice and check on Penelope. Christine was all smiles when she walked into the lobby. You look like you're feeling better, Ella remarked. The nurse crossed her fingers. I'm hoping it lasts. I usually have the most awful cramps for 3 or 4 days, but I've been fine since yesterday. Ella's grin widened, as that explained the dryad saying the magical tea would help Christine as well. She made a show of crossing her fingers, but knew there was no need. Penelope asked about you, Christine said. Not by name, but she remembered you coming to visit. She wants you to come see her. I'd like that. Remember, she has her good days and bad days. There's no guarantee she'll remember you, or that it won't trigger some sad memory like last time. Ella nodded and said, I understand, even though she was certain there was nothing to worry about. This way, Christine said. A short distance down the hall, she stopped at a doorway. Penelope, Ella is here to see you. The elderly woman smiled and said, Come in, come in. Christine said, I'm going to get back to work. Catch me on your way out, and I'll get your thermos. Thanks, Ella said as she stepped into the room. You remind me of an old friend, Penelope said once Ella reached her bedside. Ella, isn't it? Ella glanced toward the door to make sure nobody was passing by, and then answered, "Zanella, actually." The old woman's eyes widened and she gasped. "So it's true." Ella nodded and then held up a finger before going to close the door. When she returned to the bedside, she explained, "My great-grandmother is a dryad named Xantina. I asked her about Zantwilla when you said her name. Do I have her to thank for bringing me back?" Ella thought that mentioning the fairies might be a little too much, too fast, and answered, "Partially. She said that it was Zantwilla's magic too." "I've missed her so," Penelope said, and then sighed. "So much is... I only remember bits of what's happened while I've been here. I remember you coming, though. I thought you were her, come back to me somehow. It broke my heart when you realised I wasn't her," Ella admitted. "You know, I can almost hear her singing." The old woman's eyes grew distant for a few seconds, but a shake of her head brought her back. "But, enough wool gathering. I know I don't have much time left. So..." Ella hesitated, not knowing what to say, and ended up settling for, "You know?" Penelope nodded. "Yes, I know I'm not long for this world. I'm over 90, and I've known that for years. It's just more certain now. I'm ready to go. What I don't know is how you came to find me in the first place. I know I'd remember if we met before." "It's kind of a long story," Ella dodged. She was more than a little embarrassed by the selfish motivation that had eventually led her here. "I learned who you were because the campground is in danger of being foreclosed on for unpaid taxes." Even deeper furrows creased Penelope's wrinkled brow. "How can that be? I put my affairs in order years ago." "My dad is a state senator. He looked into it and said that the property taxes somehow got missed. The church has been trying to raise the money, but they're almost out of time. My family tried to make a donation, but they wouldn't take it." "Oh dear," Penelope said, and pursed her lips. Then her eyes lit up. "Miller, your father's name is Daniel Miller, isn't it?" "Yes, that's my dad." "I thought so. I voted for him, you know. I reckoned he was a good man, and after meeting you, I know I was right." Ella grinned and said, "Thanks, I'll let him know." "You do that. Tell me, do you happen to know if a woman named Carolyn is in charge of raising the money?" "Yes." The old woman nodded and sighed. "I thought so. I hope your kin can forgive her for sending your money back. She's been through so much, and when she turned to the church for strength, I'm afraid she fell in with the fire and brimstone types." How well Ella knew that. She shrugged and said, "We're used to that sort of thing. But my dad checked with some people, and he's pretty sure that he can get the land attached to the state forest if the foreclosure goes through. So at least it will be protected." "I think Zantwilla would approve of that, and I know I do," Penelope said. "It may not come to that, though. I need to talk to Carolyn and say goodbye anyway. I'll convince her to accept your family's donation if they're still willing to give." "Do you think you can?" Penelope reached out and patted her hand. "Deep down, she has a good heart. She just needs to hear things interpreted through scripture, and I'm good at that, dear. I don't know that I ever believed, but the church is a lot like Carolyn. At the heart of things, it's about love and compassion." Heartened by Penelope's confidence, Ella said, "If she'll take the money, I'm sure my family will make the donation." "And she will, dear." The old woman chuckled, looked at the phone and said, "I imagine she's in for a bit of a shock when I call her." Sensing that she wanted to catch up with those she loved, and knowing that she didn't have much time to do so, Ella said, "I should go and let you do that then." "Thank you, dear. You don't know what a gift you've given me, and thank your great-grandmother as well." "I will, and I'll come by to visit when I can," Ella said as she stood. Penelope waved her hand in a dismissive gesture. "Oh dear, you're young. You should be enjoying life, not wasting it on an old woman. There are only so many people in the world we can share our secret with. It would be nice to talk to someone I'm not related to about it once in a while." Well then, you're always welcome. It will be nice to remember her with someone who understands. Goodbye, I'll see you soon. Goodbye, dear. Ella left the door open when she returned to the hall and saw Penelope pick up the phone. It might not be a done deal, but she felt that if anyone could convince Carolyn to let her family help, it was Penelope. It was perhaps 2 hours later when her phone rang, announcing a call from her aunt. When Ella answered, Kia said, "I just had a phone call from a Ms. Carolyn Williams. Might you have anything to do with that?" "What did she say?" Ella asked, ignoring her aunt's question. "She was calling to apologise for returning our donation to the camp the way she did. She sounded sincere, so I asked her if she would accept the donation now." Ella couldn't help but smile. Penelope had been true to her word, and in record time. She prompted Kia to continue by asking, "And I'm getting ready to head to the church to drop it off now. With what she's raised, it'll be enough to pay the bill, and she shouldn't have any trouble keeping up with it going forward." Glad to hear that. You didn't answer my question, though. Did you have anything to do with this? Maybe. Maybe, Kia repeated, and Ella could almost see her aunt rolling her eyes. "I don't think I'm going to be the only one who wants to hear the story of how this happened, little Ms. Sneaky. But I'll let you off the hook for now. Good job." "Thanks. I had help, though. You can tell me the whole story later. I'm going to go drop off this money before she changes her mind. Goodbye." Ella hung up the phone, still wearing a smile. With everything that had happened since, she hadn't thought to tell anyone about the fairies yet. They were in for a huge surprise. Ella sat on the couch with John at his mother's house, wondering how she was going to survive another day. His appointment at the clinic was the next afternoon, but that felt like an eternity. It wasn't all about sex either. After having him share her bed every night for only a few weeks, she found it difficult to fall asleep without him there, and felt desperately lonely when she awakened it. She glanced at the clock and knew that it was time to go home to that empty, lonely bed. She looked at John, and she didn't have to say a word for him to know what she was thinking. He said, "You have to study and take a shower before bed. So do I." Ella pouted and said, "That doesn't mean I have to like it." She sighed before saying, "I guess I'll go. Last night, I love you." Last night was enough to cheer her ever so slightly. "I love you too." They shared a lingering kiss, and then he said, "I'm going to go take a shower." The fraction of a second pause before shower was his way of eliminating the words long and cold he would have added if his mother wasn't in the room. She knew that feeling all too well. Even though she had no reason not to assuage her needs with her fingers, or the vibrator she hadn't used in weeks, she didn't feel right doing it when he couldn't. She leaned in for one last peck on the lips, and then finally headed for the door. John's mother walked with her, took her hand after opening the door, and squeezed it in sympathy. The two women embraced, and then Ella stepped out into the cool night air, already missing him. As she reached her car and hit the button on the key fob to unlock the door, someone saying, "Excuse me," startled her enough to make her drop her keys. She looked down the sidewalk toward where the voice had arisen, and was even more shocked to see John's aunt. Carolyn crossed in front of her car to the sidewalk and approached. She stopped at the base of the driveway and said, "I need to apologise." Still in shock from the fright and the unexpected confrontation, Ella couldn't think of any way to respond. She stooped down to pick up her keys as her mind reeled, and when she stood, the sound of the door opening caused them to both turn that way. "Is everything okay?" John's mother asked as her purposeful stride carried her toward them. Her face was flat, as if she feared to let any emotion take hold within her. "Marie, is John?" Carolyn began. "He's in the shower," John's mother said, cutting her sister off. She then stopped at Ella's side to stand with her and asked, "Are you okay?" Ella found her voice to say, Yes." Marie turned her attention back to her sister and said, "Carolyn, I'm not going to stand by and let you treat Ella this way. I came to apologize, Marie. Marie hesitated when the unexpected admission derailed her train of thought, but then said, "If that's true, then it's long overdue." "I know," Carolyn agreed, and then sighed. "I'm sorry for putting you in the middle, Marie, but we can talk about that later." She then faced Ella, took a deep breath, and said, "Ella, I judged you without making any effort to know you, and I'm sorry. I don't know what to say for myself except that I was afraid." Caught off guard once more and perplexed, Ella asked, "Of me?" John's aunt shook her head and said in a small voice, "That you were going to take him away from me. I wanted to believe that I was protecting him, but that's the truth. I realise that now." Ella felt every ounce of the heartbreak in those words. She could see it in Carolyn's face as well. Empathy overwhelmed her, and she said, "I would never do that. You're a part of him, who he is. I don't want to change that. I don't want to change him." Her eyes cast downward, Carolyn said, "I'm sorry." Marie's stiff, defensive posture relaxed, and Ella could see the familiar concern of a sister in the woman's eyes. It was but one more reason for her to say what was in her heart. "I forgive you," Ella said. Carolyn looked up. "Really?" "Yes, and I'm sorry too. I haven't exactly thought nice things about you." "You had good reason." Ella shook her head and said, "No, I didn't. I didn't make any more effort to know you." A few moments of uncomfortable silence followed, until John's mother laid a hand on Ella's shoulder and asked, "Do you think you might be able to start over?" "I'd like to," Ella answered without hesitation. "Yes," Carolyn agreed. "Baby steps," John's mother suggested. "I think you may both be a little overwhelmed tonight." Ella and Carolyn both nodded in agreement. Then Carolyn asked, "Do you think John will he let me apologise?" I'll put myself in the middle one more time for that, sis." A thought occurred to Ella and she asked, "Did he take his phone into the bathroom?" "No, it's on the coffee table." "I'll send him a text so he knows I want him to listen," Ella said as she pulled her phone out of her purse. "That might help, so make sure he looks." "I will," John's mother said. The look of surprise on Carolyn's face was impossible to miss. She stammered, I... Thank you." Ella offered a half smile and finished her message. "Tell him he can call me if he needs to. It doesn't matter how late," she said as she opened her car door. "I will," Marie said, and then waved for her sister to follow her to the house. Ella climbed in, started the car, and then watched the two older women walk inside. As hurt as he felt, she knew John would forgive his aunt for what she'd done. For him, holding a grudge took work. Forgiveness came naturally. It was one of the many things she loved about him. Ella glanced at her phone, smiled, and then turned off the television. Though the results of John's second test were the same as the first, the campground's taxes were paid, and he had reconnected with his aunt. To Ella, it was reason enough to celebrate. John looked at his phone as well and stretched. "Almost midnight. We'd better get to sleep. Busy day tomorrow." He was right. Earth Day was always a full day in her family. Sleep was going to have to wait, though. She climbed out of the bed and said, "I want to show you something." "What? Right now?" She crinkled her nose and smiled. "Yes, come on." "Okay," he chuckled as he swung his legs out of bed. Ella held a finger to her lips, made a shushing sound, and then took his hand to lead him through the house. Though the lights were off, the moonlight streaming through numerous large windows lit their path. "Where are we going?" he whispered when they reached the front door. "You'll see," she answered and then giggled. Once off the porch, Ella had to tug him away from the familiar trail into the woods. Instead, she led him toward a different spot, where they stepped onto a path that had only existed for a brief time. Though the thick canopy should have made it impossible, The trail was lit as brightly as the yard in the open moonlight. The trees opened into a bow-shaped clearing, where Ella guided him to the right loop of the bow. She pointed at 2 saplings growing close together and said, "Those are ours. Nathan and Tara's are on the other side."
Huh?
Ella rolled her eyes and laughed. "You've seen Mum and Dad's tree, and Grandma and Grandpa's. Those are ours. After the hand fasting, we'll come here and bind them so they grow together into a single tree." "Oh, I get it. Why did you want to show me right now, though?" "Well," she said as she wrapped her arms around him, "that could have waited, but something else can't. We only have 1 day a year to try, and I'm not going to waste 1 minute of it." His eyes widened.
You mean...
Ella bit her lower lip and gave a slow nod as she answered, "Here, outside?" he nervously asked, and she could tell by the darkening of his cheeks that he was blushing. "Right here," Ella whispered into his ear, and then sucked the lobe. "Right now." To prove how serious she was, she grabbed the tail of his shirt and jerked it free of his pants. That must have been the moment where arousal drowned his hesitation, because he took over to whip his shirt over his head. They stepped apart to tear off their clothing in a frenzy of need. Once every garment lay scattered around them, they came together in a hungry kiss. His hardness throbbed against her mound. Their hands roamed over each other's bodies, driving their passion higher. Soon enough, Ella could wait no longer. "I need you inside me," she said before releasing him to sink down to the earth. John joined her on his knees just as she sat down and reclined. She didn't feel a single twig or acorn poking her when she settled onto the grass and leaves. Moonlight and the shadows it cast seemed to highlight every muscle in John's gorgeous body as he rose above her with his cock bouncing in anticipation. He took it in hand, and a moment later, the tip pressed against her folds. Ella groaned as his cock slipped inside her and sought her depths in a slow push. He felt absolutely huge. She whimpered, "Oh, oh, oh," as he stretched her canal and then cried out, "Oh, God," when her nether lips kissed the root of his cock. Her eyes rolled up in her head and she squeezed her breasts as she experienced fullness like nothing she'd ever felt before. "God, Ella, you feel so good," he said as he thrust again. She yelped when his balls slapped against her, sucked in a breath as he withdrew, and screamed, "Oh yes," as his cock dived back inside her. Thrust after thrust sent shockwaves of pleasure coursing through her body. Ella's head lashed back and forth, picking up leaves in her blonde tresses, not that she had the slightest awareness of it. Her whole world was John and his wonderful cock inside her. She half sat up from the intense bliss of one deep penetration, and saw her wetness glimmering along the entire length of his shaft. When it vanished inside her again, her head thumped to the earth and she screamed loud and long to the stars above. The sound warbled with his thrusts, and ended in a noisy gasp that might have embarrassed her if she had a moment to think about it. She didn't have that moment. John growled and his next thrust came faster. A loud skin-on-skin slap echoed amidst the trees, and her breasts bounced from the impact. Before they could even settle back, his cock slammed into her again and again, making the mounds dance erratically. She slapped an arm beneath them in an attempt to limit the bouncing, while clawing at the soil with her other hand. It had little effect, and she didn't have enough presence of mind to curl her fingers around one either. Ella climbed her mountain of pleasure with astonishing speed. Some tiny part of her, not overwhelmed with ecstasy, realized that neither of them had touched her clit, yet she was still nearing her peak. Within a heartbeat of it sparking to life, the flash of thought vanished into a tumultuous sea of delight. She cried out in full voice as she rushed headlong toward oblivion. She drew closer and closer, teetering on the cusp, but still her body denied her release. The sounds bursting from her throat took on a weepy cast, and then suddenly went silent in a squeak. Time seemed to stop. Her senses went numb. Then everything returned in a rush. Ella loosed a wail and dug her fingers into the forest loam as sweet agony racked her body. "Are you coming, baby?" John asked without even a hitch in his stroke. Her shrieked answer only faintly resembled the word yes. Toes curled tight and her body thrashing, Ella just kept coming. John held on tight, continuing to thrust into her clenched sheath. He'd always had more than enough stamina to satisfy her, but this was different. Long after he would have usually erupted, he was still going strong. Sweat beaded on her body despite the cool night air. Every muscle seemed to have a mind of its own, causing her to undulate and thrash under his assault. Somehow, amidst the mind-numbing pleasure, she saw John's expression was growing tight and heard his grunts of exertion growing louder. He was getting close to the point of no return. In a moment of clarity, she thought that it was surely after midnight. It was Earth Day, she was fertile, and he was about to fill her full. Despite the long odds, she wished with all her heart, and an electric chill tingled in her every pore. Then it hit her. The sound of her heart pounding in her ears dulled her croaking scream. Her vision swam, and darkness crept in from the edges. It was no mere aftershock or spike in the pleasure, but another orgasm taking her before the first even ended. Everything was a jumbled blur of ecstasy until John slammed into her one last time and roared. She went from one extreme to the other. Incoherent rapture gave way to an intense focus on his cock buried inside her. She could feel every pulse and throb of the hard organ. Hot jets of cum blasted against the entrance of her womb to pool in her depths. She could even feel the twitch of his tight balls against her nether lips. Her intimate muscles contracted and relaxed of their own accord, milking him until he fell forward atop her. A sweet moan of perfect satisfaction escaped her as she embraced him with trembling arms. Long minutes passed before the aftershocks faded, and she could catch her breath enough to say, "I love you." I love you, he responded in a high-pitched voice. A moment later, a squeeze of her walls caused him to jerk his softening cock from her and whimper. Ella offered a weak chuckle as he slid off to the side and rolled onto his back. She asked, "Where did that come from, baby?" He shook his head and mumbled something that sounded like, "I don't know." "I don't either, but wow." "Uh-huh." They lay in silence for a time, letting their racing hearts settle and listening to the crickets chirp. Ella reached for his hand, and he clasped it while they stared up at the stars. Ella let out an "oh" of surprise when she felt his cream seeping from inside her. She clamped her legs together, pulled her knees toward her chest, and held them there. "What are you doing?" John asked, amused by the spectacle. Ella moaned and said, "I don't want any to escape." "Remember what we said, honey?" She ignored the substance of what he said to say. "I like that. Honey, it's wifey." "Wifey?" He shook his head for a moment and then chuckled. "Don't change the subject. We're not supposed to be getting our hopes up." "I'm not." After a brief pause, she admitted, "Too much," and let her legs drop back to the ground. "I don't hear you complaining about trying." "Nope." Ella scooted closer and rested her head on his shoulder. "Good, because we're going to be trying a lot today. Are you up for that?" "As often as I can get it up," he said and kissed the top of her head. "Good answer," she said as she snuggled against him. Xantina cuddled with her mate, still quivering from the aftershocks of her own orgasm. She let her senses drift, bolstered by the strength of magic her ever-expanding family granted her. A young nurse lying in bed and trying to fall asleep rubbed her breasts, which felt heavy and tender. She vividly remembered the conversation she had with her sister about her siblings' first pregnancy. Tender breasts and an insatiable libido had told her she was with child long before a pregnancy test. Christine knew the chances were slim. She'd come to accept that, yet she couldn't help but hope and wish. The Dryad smiled, knowing the young nurse's wish had been granted, and that it was only the first. A single sip of tea made with the water of the fairy world had forever mended the ills that had kept her from conceiving. Xantina reached out elsewhere, to a window in a building just outside the city limits. Within, Penelope breathed her last with the faint hints of a smile tugging at her sleeping lips. Her spirit soared skyward, and Xantina followed. Within the woods she had loved, nurtured, and protected, Penelope's spirit alighted next to a hollow, blackened stump, where another spirit coalesced from the nature around her. 3 fairies trailing sparkling motes of light circled the embracing spirits of Penelope and Xantwilla as they faded, going together to that which waited beyond. In the earth below, an acorn that had waited patiently through the years for this moment sprouted. And finally, Xantina turned her senses to a place within her own wood. There, Zanella and her mate held each other in the afterglow of their lovemaking. Though they had faced many trials, their love now had the blessing of his entire family, including his aunt. And within Ella, an egg released only minutes before joined with John's seed, sparking a new life and fulfilling the unspoken promise that was the blessing of the wood.